In the spring of 2011, while the rest of Silicon Valley was still figuring out how to make money from mobile apps, a startup called Color Labs walked into the venture capital scene and casually picked up $41 million before they'd even launched their product. Not 41,000, not 4.1 million, $41 million. For a photo-sharing app that nobody had seen, nobody had tested, and as it turned out, nobody particularly wanted. This wasn't just overfunding, this was venture capital on steroids, and it created one of the most spectacular faceplants in startup history. Color Labs managed to raise more money in their Series A than Instagram's entire acquisition price just 1 year later, yet they couldn't survive long enough to see Facebook write that billion-dollar check to their competitors. The story of Color isn't just about a failed app, it's about what happens when Silicon Valley's hype machine goes completely off the rails and everyone forgets to ask the most basic question in business: why would anyone actually want this? The mastermind behind this spectacular miscalculation was Bill Nguyen, a serial entrepreneur who'd already sold 2 companies and had the kind of track record that makes venture capitalists open their checkbooks before asking too many questions. Nguyen had founded Lala, a music streaming service that Apple acquired for $80 million in 2009, and before that he'd built and sold OnBox, an early cloud storage company. So when Nguyen came knocking with his next big idea, investors lined up like it was Black Friday at the Apple Store. His pitch was deceptively simple: create a photo-sharing app that would automatically connect you with other users nearby, turning every moment into a potential social experience. The concept was that you'd take photos, and they'd be instantly shared with other Color users in your vicinity, creating what Nguyen called elastic networks of people who happened to be in the same place at the same time. On paper, it sounded revolutionary. In practice, it was about as appealing as having strangers rifle through your photo album while you're trying to eat dinner. Color's funding round wasn't just large, it was absurdly, ridiculously, almost offensively large for a company that had never shipped a product. Sequoia Capital led the round, joined by Bain Capital Ventures and Silicon Valley Bank, pumping $41 million into a team of just 17 people. That's over $2 million per employee before they'd written a single line of production code. The funding announcement sent shockwaves through the startup community, not because people were excited about Color, but because nobody could figure out what justified that kind of investment. TechCrunch called it the most overfunded startup in history, and that was before anyone knew how badly the app would perform. The funding gave Color a pre-launch valuation of $100 million, putting it in the same league as companies like Groupon and Zynga that had millions of active users and proven revenue models. Color had neither users nor revenue, but they did have Bill Nguyen's track record and a pitch deck that apparently contained some very persuasive slides. When Color finally launched in March 2011, the app immediately revealed why raising $41 million might have been premature. The core concept was fundamentally flawed from a user experience perspective. You'd open the app, take a photo, and it would be shared with other Color users within a 150-foot radius. But here's the problem. If there weren't other Color users nearby, your photos just disappeared into the void. And since Color was brand new, there weren't other users anywhere, let alone within 150 feet of wherever you happened to be standing. This created what's known in the tech world as a cold start problem, except Color's cold start problem was more like a frozen solid problem. Users would download the app, take a few photos that nobody would see, then delete the app and never think about it again. The network effect that was supposed to make Color magical required a critical mass of users that Color never achieved, creating a vicious cycle where the lack of users prevented new users from having a good experience, which prevented Color from getting more users. The technical execution was just as problematic as the concept. Color's app was buggy, slow, and crashed frequently, which is exactly what you don't want when you're trying to convince people to adopt a new social behavior. The photo quality was mediocre, the interface was confusing, and the app drained battery life like a smartphone vampire. Users complained that they couldn't figure out how to use basic features, and even when the app worked as intended, the experience felt invasive and pointless. Why would you want random strangers to see your photos just because they happen to be standing near you? The app launched without basic privacy controls, so users had no way to prevent their photos from being seen by nearby Color users, which made many people uncomfortable. Color's assumption was that people wanted more serendipitous connections with strangers, but it turned out most people preferred sharing photos with people they actually knew and liked. This might seem obvious in hindsight, but apparently it wasn't obvious to the team that had just raised $41 million to prove otherwise. The market timing couldn't have been worse for Color's particular approach to photo sharing. Instagram had launched just 5 months earlier and was already demonstrating that people wanted to share beautiful, filtered photos with their existing social networks, not random, unfiltered photos with strangers who happened to be nearby. Instagram's approach was simple, elegant, and tapped into people's existing desire to curate and share their best moments. Color's approach was complex, invasive, and tried to create entirely new social behaviors around unwanted proximity-based sharing. While Instagram was growing by hundreds of thousands of users per month, Color was struggling to retain the users it already had. The photo sharing space was becoming increasingly crowded, with Facebook launching its own mobile photo features and dozens of other startups trying to capture some of Instagram's momentum. Color needed to offer something dramatically better than the alternatives, but instead they offered something dramatically weirder. And weird rarely wins in consumer technology. 6 months after launch, Color was forced to confront the brutal reality of their user numbers, or lack thereof. Despite having more funding than most startups see in their entire lifetimes, Color had failed to gain meaningful traction. The app had been downloaded millions of times, but almost nobody was actually using it regularly. Daily active users were in the low thousands, not the millions Color needed to justify their valuation. The company burned through money at an alarming rate, spending heavily on marketing, engineering talent, and office space while generating essentially zero revenue. Bill Nguyen and his team began pivoting desperately, trying to figure out what people actually wanted from a photo app. They added new features, changed the interface, and even experimented with different sharing models, but nothing seemed to work. The fundamental problem wasn't technical, it was conceptual. Color had built a solution to a problem that didn't exist, and no amount of engineering or marketing could fix that disconnect. By early 2012, less than a year after their high-profile launch, Color was already running out of runway despite their massive funding round. The company laid off employees and began exploring acquisition opportunities, but potential buyers were scared off by Color's lack of user engagement and unclear path to profitability. Sequoia Capital and the other investors were facing the uncomfortable reality that they'd made a very expensive bet on a product that simply didn't work. The startup press, which had been skeptical from the beginning, began writing Color's obituary while the company was still technically alive. TechCrunch published articles with headlines like "Color, What Went Wrong" and "The Spectacular Failure of Color Labs," dissecting every mistake the company had made. The schadenfreude was palpable throughout Silicon Valley, where Color had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of overfunding and underthinking. Color's death spiral accelerated throughout 2012 as user numbers continued to decline and the company burned through the remainder of their funding. Bill Nguyen made several desperate attempts to save the company, including pivoting to enterprise applications and exploring partnerships with major brands, but nothing could generate the kind of traction Color needed to survive. The proximity-based photo sharing concept that had seemed so innovative in pitch meetings proved to be a complete non-starter in the real world, where people valued privacy, control, and meaningful connections over random interactions with nearby strangers. In October 2012, just 19 months after launching with such fanfare, Color Labs officially shut down. The company's assets were sold to Apple for a reported $2 to $7 million, a tiny fraction of the $41 million investors had poured into the company. Most of Color's engineering team joined Apple, but the Color app itself was discontinued, disappearing from the App Store as quietly as it had failed to make an impact while it was there. The Color Labs debacle became an instant classic in Silicon Valley's Hall of Fame of spectacular failures, joining other overhyped startups like Webvan and Pets.com in the pantheon of companies that raised too much money for products nobody wanted. The failure highlighted several dangerous trends in venture capital, including the tendency to fund charismatic entrepreneurs without adequately vetting their ideas, the assumption that throwing more money at a problem will solve it, and the Silicon Valley echo chamber effect that can make bad ideas seem brilliant if enough smart people pretend to believe in them. Color raised more money than Instagram, Snapchat, and Pinterest combined in their early rounds, yet failed to achieve even a fraction of their success because funding doesn't create product-market fit, it just makes the inevitable crash more expensive. The Color story became required reading in business schools and startup accelerators, a perfect example of how not to build a consumer technology company. Bill Nguyen went on to found other startups, but never again with $41 million in funding before proving his concept actually worked. The investors who backed Color mostly recovered from their losses, but the startup became a permanent reminder that in Silicon Valley, sometimes the biggest funding rounds produce the smallest results, and the most overfunded companies often become the most spectacular failures.